Ice formed on the inside walls of every cabin in the valley that January night, except one. While his neighbors burned through their winter wood supply, trying to stay alive in temperatures that dropped to 20 below zero, Nathaniel Frost sat comfortably in his tree cabin with a fire half the size, warm enough to work by candlelight, in his shirt sleeves. Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if you love stories about forgotten frontier ingenuity, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The fire had been roaring for 6 hours, and Thomas was still shivering. Nathaniel Frost added another log to the flames, watching sparks spiral up through the gaps in their poorly constructed chimney. The cabin walls groaned under the assault of wind that howled across the Montana Valley like a living thing determined to find its way inside. Despite the massive fire consuming their carefully rationed wood at an alarming rate, frost crept across the interior walls in delicate patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't terrifying. It was January 18th, 41, and the temperature outside had plummeted to depths that old trappers claimed they'd never witnessed. Nathaniel had stuffed rags into every visible gap between the logs, had packed snow against the exterior walls for insulation, had done everything the experienced men had taught him. None of it mattered. The cold was winning. Thomas lay on the sleeping platform wrapped in every blanket they owned, plus both their coats. He was 22 years old, 4 years younger than Nathaniel, and he had stopped shivering an hour ago. Nathaniel knew that was a bad sign. He had heard stories about the final stage of freezing, when the body gave up trying to generate warmth and a strange, peaceful feeling took over. Men said it was like falling asleep. They said it didn't hurt at the end. Nathaniel fed the fire constantly, burning through wood that was supposed to last another month. The flames roared hot enough that standing directly in front of the fireplace was almost comfortable, but 3 feet away the cold reasserted itself with brutal authority. Heat rose straight up and disappeared through the poorly sealed roof. The walls, just single logs with moss chinking that had dried and cracked, provided almost no insulation. Every gust of wind seemed to blow straight through the structure. Around midnight, the wood supply ran out. Nathaniel had burned everything they had, including the chair and one of their storage shelves, desperately trying to generate enough heat to keep his brother alive. He wrapped himself around Thomas, sharing body heat in the way animals did, hoping it would be enough. The fire died to coals, and the temperature inside the cabin dropped rapidly. Thomas died just before dawn. Nathaniel felt it happen, felt his brother's body go still and cold, despite being wrapped in Nathaniel's arms. The sun rose on a morning so clear and bright it hurt to look at, and Nathaniel Frost sat in a frozen cabin holding his brother's body, understanding with absolute clarity that Thomas hadn't died from bad luck, or insufficient supplies, or any failure of courage. He had died because their cabin was fundamentally incapable of protecting them from serious cold. The shelter they had trusted with their lives was, in the end, barely better than sleeping in the open. Nathaniel buried Thomas on a hillside overlooking the valley where they had planned to build their future. He marked the grave with stones and spent 3 days alone in the cabin that had killed his brother, unable to leave, unable to stay. The structure felt different now. Every gap between logs seemed wider. Every draft felt like a betrayal. He had trusted this building with the most important thing in his life, and it had failed completely. Most men would have abandoned the valley, left the mountains entirely, sought easier country where winter was less brutal. Nathaniel stayed. Something had broken inside him during those hours holding Thomas's cooling body. But what emerged wasn't despair, it was obsession. He needed to understand why the cabin had failed so catastrophically. He needed to know if there was any way to build shelter that could actually protect a man from serious cold. He started studying cabins the way a doctor might study disease. Within a week, he had visited every structure within 10 miles, asking questions that made people uncomfortable. How much wood did they burn on the coldest nights? Where did they feel drafts? Had they ever measured the temperature difference between inside and outside? Most trappers and homesteaders thought he was losing his mind. They accepted cold as an unchangeable reality of mountain life. You built the best cabin you could. You burned enormous amounts of wood, and you hoped winter didn't kill you. That was simply how things were. Nathaniel began documenting patterns. He carried a small thermometer he had purchased in St. Louis the previous year, one of the few luxuries he had allowed himself. On cold days, he would measure exterior temperature, then interior temperature in various cabins with fires burning. The results were disturbingly consistent. A cabin with a roaring fire might achieve 15 to 20 degrees warmer than outside. On a night when exterior temperature dropped to 20 below zero, interior temperature would struggle to reach zero, even with constant fire. The math was simple and brutal. Human bodies needed temperatures above freezing to survive extended periods. Standard cabin construction couldn't reliably provide that during extreme cold. He identified the failure points through careful observation. Heat rose and escaped through poorly sealed roofs. Wind penetrated gaps in log chinking, creating convective cooling that stripped warmth away constantly. The logs themselves conducted cold from outside to inside. 4. Fully exposed walls meant maximum surface area for heat loss. Large interior volumes required massive amounts of fuel to heat. Every element of standard cabin design worked against thermal retention. Nathaniel filled a notebook with observations, sketches, and calculations. He drew diagrams showing heat flow patterns, arrows indicating where warmth escaped. He calculated surface area ratios and estimated fuel consumption rates. The conclusion was inescapable. A freestanding log cabin with 4 exposed walls, a vulnerable roof, and large interior volume was fundamentally inefficient at retaining heat. You could build it better, use tighter chinking, improve the roof, but you were fighting against basic physics. The design itself was the problem. February brought slightly warmer weather, though winter still gripped the valley with authority. Nathaniel spent his days hunting and checking trap lines, trying to replenish supplies depleted during January's desperate fight against cold. He moved through the forest differently now, paying attention to things he had previously ignored. He noticed where animals sheltered, how they survived temperatures that killed unprepared humans. On a clear afternoon following fresh snowfall, Nathaniel tracked a black bear to its winter den. He had no intention of disturbing the animal, just wanted to understand where it had chosen to sleep through winter. The den was located inside an enormous hollow cedar tree, ancient and partially dead, with an opening near the base barely large enough for the bear to squeeze through. Nathaniel approached cautiously after confirming the bear was deep in hibernation, its breathing slow and steady from within the dark interior. He knelt at the opening and carefully extended his hand inside, not far enough to touch the bear, but far enough to feel the air quality. The difference was startling. Outside temperature was perhaps 15 degrees. Inside the tree, the air felt dramatically warmer, maybe 40 degrees or more. The bear's body heat was part of it, but even accounting for that, the hollow tree was retaining warmth in a way no cabin Nathaniel had seen could match. The tree's massive wooden walls, 2 feet thick in places, provided insulation no man-made structure could replicate. The small opening minimized heat loss. The enclosed space was perfectly sized for the animal's needs. Nathaniel sat back on his heels, studying the tree with new eyes. He had seen countless hollow trees throughout his years in the mountains, had always viewed them as firewood sources or obstacles to navigation. Now he was seeing them as engineering solutions that nature had perfected over centuries. Animals instinctively chose tree cavities for winter shelter because they worked better than any alternative. Over the following weeks, he began observing other tree-dwelling creatures. Squirrels nested in hollow trunks and emerged on even the coldest days. their tree homes maintaining stable temperatures. Raccoons denned in massive oaks, staying warm through brutal cold snaps. Owls roosted in dead trees with natural cavities protected from wind and temperature extremes. Every observation reinforced the same principle. Enclosed spaces within thick wooden walls retained heat far more efficiently than exposed structures. Nathaniel found himself studying large trees with the intensity he had previously reserved for trap placement and hunting strategies. He looked for hollows, cavities, naturally protected spaces within trunks, and root systems. He measured diameters, estimated wall thickness, calculated interior volumes. An idea was forming, something so unconventional that even thinking about it seemed absurd. But the more he observed, the more convinced he became that animals understood something about winter shelter that humans had completely missed. They didn't build structures exposed to the elements. They found protection within existing natural insulation. The tree itself was the shelter. March brought the first signs of spring thaw, and with it the return of trappers who had wintered in other valleys. Nathaniel had kept mostly to himself through February, but with the arrival of neighbors and trading partners, isolation was no longer possible. Men gathered at Willem Decker's larger cabin to trade supplies, share news, and plan for the coming trapping season. Nathaniel attended, knowing his absence would seem strange, dreading the questions about Thomas. Willem was a Dutch immigrant who had been trapping these mountains for 8 years. He was practical, experienced, and generally well regarded in the scattered community of men who worked this region. When Nathaniel arrived, Willem offered genuine condolences about Thomas, then mercifully moved conversation to other topics. Silas Crane was less tactful. He was a loud man from Pennsylvania who believed volume conveyed authority and who seemed to view every interaction as an opportunity to establish dominance. The conversation eventually turned to cabin construction. Several men planned to build new structures or repair existing ones before next winter. Standard techniques were discussed, debated, with the seriousness of men whose lives depended on getting details right. Nathaniel listened quietly until Willem directly asked his plans. Did he intend to stay in the valley? Would he rebuild the cabin where Thomas died? Nathaniel set down his coffee cup and spoke carefully. He explained that he had spent the past 2 months studying why cabins failed in extreme cold. He described his observations about heat loss, surface area, and thermal efficiency. Men listened with expressions ranging from interest to impatience. Then he told them his solution. He had found an enormous dead cedar tree with a hollow base and massive root system. He intended to build his cabin inside the tree, using the natural structure as walls and roof, creating a shelter that would require a fraction of the wood to heat and would maintain stable temperature through any cold. The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds before Silas Crane started laughing. It was genuine laughter, the kind that comes from hearing something so absurd it catches you off guard. Others joined in, more uncomfortable than mocking, unsure if Nathaniel was joking. Willem asked seriously if Nathaniel truly intended to live inside a tree like a squirrel. The question wasn't meant cruelly, but it crystallized exactly how insane the plan sounded. Nathaniel tried to explain the mathematics, the thermal principles, the observations about animal dens. Silas cut him off, calling him Frost the Fool, saying grief had obviously damaged his thinking. Others suggested more kindly that perhaps Nathaniel should consider returning east, that mountain life might be too hard for him now. The message was clear. His plan was rejected not just as impractical, but as evidence of mental instability brought on by tragedy. Nathaniel left Willem's cabin, knowing he would receive no help or encouragement from the trapping community. Their ridicule stung less than he expected. He had lived through watching his brother freeze to death. Compared to that, being called a fool carried little weight. What mattered was proving the concept worked, and that required finding the right tree. He had already scouted several candidates during February's observations, but now he needed to make a final selection. The requirements were specific. The tree needed to be dead or dying, eliminating concerns about damaging a living giant. It needed a natural hollow or cavity large enough to accommodate a small cabin interior. The root system needed to create protective overhang that could serve as a roof structure. The location needed to be defensible, with clear sight lines and access to water. Most importantly, the tree's structural integrity needed to be sound enough to remain stable for years. Nathaniel spent 5 days examining 3 potential candidates. The first was a massive Douglas fir with an impressive, hollow base, but the root system had rotted in several places, creating instability concerns. The second was a cedar with perfect interior space, but it stood in a low depression that would flood during spring snowmelt. The third was located perfectly, but the hollow was too small to accommodate even a minimal living space. On the 6th day, he found what he needed. The tree stood on a slight rise 2 miles from where Thomas was buried, surrounded by forest but with enough clearing that approaching threats would be visible. It was a western red cedar, dead for perhaps 20 years, based on bark condition, but still structurally sound. The trunk measured 18 feet in diameter at the base. Previous forest fires had hollowed the interior decades earlier, creating a cavity roughly 8 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The ceiling height reached 12 feet at the center, where the hollow extended upward into the trunk. What made this tree extraordinary was the root system. Massive roots, each 3 to 4 feet in diameter, arched outward and upward from the base like flying buttresses on a cathedral. They created a natural sheltered space that extended another 6 feet beyond the hollow interior. The roots formed a roof structure that had already proven itself by shedding snow and rain for decades. Nathaniel walked around the tree repeatedly, studying it from every angle, calculating possibilities. He spent 2 full days inside the hollow, sitting in the space where his cabin would be, observing how air moved, how light entered, how the massive wooden walls surrounding him seemed to moderate temperature even without any fire. The wood itself held heat from sunny days and released it slowly at night. The enclosed space felt inherently protected in ways an exposed structure never could. Nathaniel made his decision on March 21st, the spring equinox. He marked the tree with his initials carved into the exterior bark. This would be his home. This giant dead cedar would become the structure that proved everyone wrong. He had 7 months until serious cold returned. That would be enough time to build something unprecedented. Before cutting a single log or moving any supplies, Nathaniel spent 3 weeks planning on paper. He had purchased a surveyor's notebook in St. Louis years earlier, intending to map trap lines. Now he filled its pages with sketches, calculations, and detailed construction plans. If this project failed, it wouldn't be from lack of preparation. He started by measuring everything precisely. The tree's interior cavity was 7 feet 9 inches deep and 9 feet 6 inches wide at the widest point. The ceiling height varied from 12 feet at center to 8 feet at the edges, where the hollow narrowed. The root overhang extended 6 feet 3 inches beyond the cavity opening. The natural opening faced southeast, which would provide morning sun but protection from prevailing northwestern winter winds. Nathaniel calculated surface area exposure. A standard freestanding cabin 12 feet by 12 feet had 4 full walls exposed to elements, totaling 576 square feet of exterior surface through which heat could escape. His tree-integrated design would have only 1 full wall exposed, the front wall he would build to enclose the cavity opening. The sides and back were already protected by 2 feet of solid cedar. The roof was protected by massive roots and the tree's crown structure. Total exposed surface area would be approximately 120 square feet, less than 1/4 of a traditional cabin. He worked through thermal calculations using principles he barely understood but could observe in practice. The cedar walls provided insulation value equivalent to perhaps 10 layers of standard log construction. The reduced surface area meant proportionally less heat loss. The protected location eliminated wind penetration that caused convective cooling. The smaller interior volume, roughly 700 cubic feet compared to typical cabin volumes of 1,500 cubic feet, meant less space to heat. Nathaniel estimated fuel requirements based on his winter observations. A standard cabin maintaining livable temperature during extreme cold required approximately 40 pounds of firewood every 6 hours. His calculations suggested the tree cabin might maintain equal or better warmth using 15 pounds of wood in the same period. The fuel savings alone would be revolutionary, but the real advantage was temperature stability. The massive thermal mass of the tree would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night, moderating temperature swings that made standard cabins unbearable. He sketched the front wall construction in detail. It would need to be substantial enough to match the protection provided by the tree's natural walls. He planned for logs 12 inches in diameter, carefully fitted with minimal gaps, chinked with a clay mixture he would develop. The door would be reinforced and positioned to minimize heat loss. Windows would be small and strategically placed for light and ventilation without compromising thermal efficiency. The fireplace location required careful thought. He would build it against the tree's interior wall, insulating between fire and wood to prevent combustion risk. The chimney would vent through a natural gap in the root structure overhead. Heat from the fireplace would warm the cabin interior, but more importantly, it would warm the surrounding cedar walls, which would hold and radiate that heat for hours after the fire diminished. April arrived with weather that alternated between late winter storms and genuine spring warmth. Nathaniel began construction on the first clear day, knowing he had limited time before trapping season demanded his attention. He needed to establish basic shelter before leaving to work his trap lines. The full construction could continue through summer and fall, but he wanted the fundamental structure completed quickly. He started by clearing the area around the tree. Decades of accumulated debris, fallen branches, and undergrowth had piled around the base. Nathaniel spent 4 days removing everything, exposing the root structure fully, and creating a clean workspace. He was careful not to damage the roots themselves, recognizing they were structural elements he would incorporate into his design. The first construction task was preparing the tree's interior. The hollow cavity had accumulated rotted wood, animal nests, and general debris over decades. Nathaniel cleaned everything out, examining the interior walls carefully as he worked. The wood was sound despite being dead for years. Cedar's natural rot resistance had preserved the structure remarkably well. He used a draw knife to smooth interior surfaces, removing loose bark and checking for any structural weaknesses. He found none that concerned him. With the interior prepared, he began cutting logs for the front wall. He selected standing dead lodgepole pines, straight and approximately 12 inches in diameter. Each tree required careful evaluation. He wanted wood that was seasoned but not rotted, straight-grained without excessive twist or taper. He felled 9 trees over 3 days, delimbed them, and cut them to 11-foot lengths that would span from ground to the top of the cavity opening. Hauling the logs to the tree site was brutal work without Thomas to help. Nathaniel rigged a simple drag system using ropes and a lever arrangement that allowed him to move logs individually. Each log took 2 to 3 hours to transport from cutting site to the cedar tree. By the end of the second week of April, he had all 9 logs positioned near where they would be installed. On April 19th, Nathaniel set the first log. He had dug a shallow trench across the front of the cavity, filled it with rocks for drainage and stability. The first log sat in this trench, positioned precisely to create the base of his front wall. He used a level to ensure it was true, then began the process of shaping and fitting the second log to rest on top of the first. The fitting process was meticulous. Nathaniel used his draw knife to shape the bottom of each log to match the curve of the log beneath it, creating tight contact that minimized gaps. Each log took hours to fit properly. He worked alone, using a ramp and lever system to lift logs into position, checking fit, removing and reshaping, then testing again. Magnus Halvorsen arrived on the afternoon of the third day to find Nathaniel wrestling a log into position using an elaborate arrangement of ropes and wooden levers. Magnus was a Norwegian immigrant who had homesteaded a valley 15 miles east. He was known for careful, methodical work and for thinking before speaking. Magnus stayed for 3 days, helping position logs and asking careful questions about Nathaniel's techniques. Unlike the others, he didn't mock. He studied the integration between man-made wall and natural tree structure, traced his hands along the tight log fitting, and examined how Nathaniel was creating connections that would make the cabin and tree function as a single unit. When he left, he said simply that he would watch to see if it worked. By late April, the front wall stood complete. 9 logs stacked precisely, fitted with gaps so minimal that light barely passed through. But the wall alone wasn't shelter. Nathaniel needed to seal it, protect it, and most importantly, create a roof that would complete the enclosed space. This was where his design departed most radically from conventional construction. Standard cabins required building a complete roof structure from scratch, spanning the building's width with ridge poles, covering them with planks or bark, adding waterproofing layers, and hoping the whole assembly held together through winter snow loads. It was time-consuming, material-intensive, and often the weakest point of frontier construction. Nathaniel's tree offered something unprecedented. The massive roots arching overhead were already a roof, had been performing that function successfully for decades. He spent 2 days simply studying the root structure, understanding how the natural elements fit together. The main roots radiated outward from the central trunk like spokes of a wheel, each 3 to 4 feet in diameter. Secondary roots branched off the main ones, creating a lattice pattern overhead. The spaces between roots varied from 6 inches to 2 feet wide. Rain and snowmelt had been running through these gaps for years, but the deep overhang meant water fell well away from the cavity opening. Nathaniel's task was to seal those gaps without damaging the roots or creating a structure so rigid it would fail if the roots shifted. He started by cutting thin cedar planks from a dead tree near his construction site. The planks were 2 inches thick, 12 inches wide, and varied in length from 3 to 6 feet. He shaped each one to fit between specific roots, creating puzzle pieces that filled gaps while conforming to the irregular curves of the natural wood. Installing the planks required working overhead, often in awkward positions wedged among the roots. Nathaniel built a simple platform that allowed him to reach the overhead structure safely. He fitted each plank carefully, wedging them between roots and securing them with wooden pegs driven into pre-drilled holes. The pegs allowed some flexibility while preventing the planks from shifting. Over the planks, he laid overlapping sections of birch bark he had harvested and stored during winter. Birch bark was naturally waterproof, flexible, and durable. He overlapped each section like roof shingles, ensuring water would run downward over the joints rather than through them. He secured the bark using thin wooden strips pegged across seams. The final layer was clay mixed with pine resin and horsehair. Nathaniel had been experimenting with chinking mixtures throughout construction, testing different ratios until he found a combination that was waterproof, flexible, and adhesive. The roof completion in early May meant Nathaniel had created an enclosed space protected from weather, but shelter without heat was merely a tomb that would kill more slowly than exposure. The fireplace represented both his greatest technical challenge and his biggest safety concern. He was proposing to build a fire inside a wooden structure against wooden walls with a wooden roof overhead. One mistake would turn his innovation into a death trap. Nathaniel had studied fireplace construction in St. Louis during his supply trips, watching masons work and asking questions that revealed his ignorance but fed his understanding. He learned that successful fireplaces required 3 elements working together: a firebox that contained flames and directed heat efficiently, a chimney that created draft to pull smoke upward and exhaust it safely, and most critically, sufficient insulation between fire and combustible materials to prevent ignition. He began by gathering stones. The valley offered abundant granite deposited by ancient glaciers, broken into pieces ranging from fist-sized to massive boulders requiring lever systems to move. Nathaniel spent a week collecting and transporting rocks, selecting each piece for how it would fit into the structure he envisioned: flat stones for the hearth, angular pieces for the walls, a large flat slab for the mantel. The hearth came first. He dug a shallow depression in the earth floor at the rear of the cavity, against the tree's interior wall, but not touching it. He filled this depression with gravel for drainage, then laid flat stones to create a fireproof floor extending 4 feet out from where the firebox would be. The stone hearth was critical. Any embers that fell from the fire would land on stone rather than on wood shavings or other flammable debris. Between the hearth and the cedar wall, Nathaniel created an insulation barrier. He dug the trench 2 feet deep and filled it with river clay, packing it tight and allowing it to dry for 3 days. Over the dried clay, he built a wall of stones 2 feet thick, mortared with more clay mixed with sand and crushed rock. This stone wall created absolute separation between the tree's wood and the fire that would burn just feet away. The firebox itself was constructed with care that bordered on obsession. Nathaniel built it using the flattest stones he could find, fitted together with minimal mortar. The interior dimensions were 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 3 feet tall, large enough to burn substantial logs, small enough to concentrate heat. He angled the rear wall slightly forward to reflect heat into the room rather than straight up the chimney. The chimney presented the greatest challenge. It needed to create sufficient draft to pull smoke upward, needed to be positioned to vent through the root structure overhead without creating fire risk, and needed to be accessible for cleaning when creosote accumulated. Nathaniel built it using stones on the lower section, transitioning to clay tiles he shaped by hand for the upper portion that would pass near and through the roots. June brought the warmth that made mountain life tolerable and allowed Nathaniel to focus on finishing details without the urgency of approaching winter. It also brought visitors. Word of Frost's tree cabin had spread through the scattered trapping community with the speed that remarkable stupidity always travels. Men came to see for themselves, bringing skepticism that ranged from amused curiosity to genuine concern. Silas Crane arrived first, leading 3 other trappers who wanted to witness the madness firsthand. They found Nathaniel working on window shutters, carefully fitting hinges he had forged himself from scrap iron. Silas walked around the tree slowly, studying the construction with an expression that mixed disbelief and something approaching anger, as if Nathaniel's unconventional approach was a personal insult to proper frontier methodology. The front wall logs were tight and well-fitted, Silas admitted grudgingly, but building against a dead tree was asking for disaster. The wood would rot, he insisted, even though cedar was famous for rot resistance. Rain would seep between cabin and tree, creating moisture that would destroy everything. The structure would attract insects, bears would tear it apart trying to reach the cavity, and the whole assembly would collapse within 2 years. Each criticism was delivered with absolute certainty, as if Silas possessed engineering knowledge that Nathaniel lacked. But the greatest concern, repeated by every visitor, was fire. Building a fireplace inside a wooden cavity was suicidal. The insulation barrier Nathaniel had created was inadequate, they claimed. Clay would crack, stones would shift, and eventually flame would reach dry cedar that would ignite like tinder. The tree would become a massive torch with Nathaniel trapped inside. Several men stated flatly that they wouldn't help rescue him when it happened. They would only help bury whatever remained. Reverend Amos Fletcher arrived in late June during his circuit through the region. He was a Methodist minister who traveled between isolated settlements bringing services, news, and moral guidance to people who saw other humans rarely. Fletcher was educated, well-meaning, and thoroughly convinced that conventional wisdom existed for good reasons. He examined Nathaniel's cabin with the air of a doctor reviewing symptoms of mental illness. Fletcher's objection was theological as much as practical. God had provided trees as building material, he explained patiently. Men were meant to cut timber and construct proper shelters, demonstrating dominion over creation through organized labor and established techniques. Living inside a tree like an animal represented a rejection of human dignity and divine order. It was regression rather than progress, abandoning civilized methodology for something primitive and shameful. Nathaniel listened to these criticisms without arguing. He had learned that defending his choices only intensified opposition. Instead, he continued working, demonstrating through action rather than words. He showed visitors the stone insulation barrier, explained the clay resin waterproofing, described the thermal calculations behind his design. Most left unconvinced. A few, like Magnus Halverson, who returned twice during summer, studied the construction with genuine interest. Summer progressed with long days that allowed Nathaniel to work from dawn until darkness made precision impossible. By July, the basic structure was complete, but the difference between shelter and home lay in countless small details that would determine whether his innovation succeeded or failed. Each element required the same obsessive attention he had given to major components. The door was his first priority. He had seen too many cabin doors that were merely planks held together with cross pieces, adequate for keeping out wind, but useless against determined bears or extreme cold. Nathaniel built his door using techniques borrowed from warehouse construction he had observed in St. Louis. He selected 3 thick planks from dense pine heartwood, each 2.5 inches thick and joined using tongue and groove joints that interlocked like puzzle pieces. He reinforced the assembled door with diagonal iron straps salvaged from a broken wagon he had found abandoned miles from any trail. The straps were bolted through the wood, creating a rigid structure that wouldn't warp or twist. The door weighed nearly 70 pounds when completed, but it hung perfectly on hinges he had forged himself and set into mortises cut deep into both door and frame. Opening and closing, it required deliberate effort, but that weight meant it would seal completely against the frame. The locking mechanism was equally substantial. A thick oak bar dropped into iron brackets mounted to the interior wall, making forced entry from outside nearly impossible. Nathaniel added a secondary lock, a wooden beam that slid horizontally through brackets and into a mortise cut in the adjacent tree cavity wall. When engaged, the door was effectively part of the tree structure itself. Windows presented a different challenge. He needed light and ventilation, but couldn't afford the heat loss that came with large openings. His solution was 2 small windows, each only 12 inches square, positioned high on the front wall, 6 feet above the floor. The elevated placement made them difficult targets for anything trying to break in and minimized heat loss since warm air rose and wouldn't pour out through openings near ground level. Each window had a shutter built from the same thick planks as the door, reinforced with iron and hinged on the interior. Behind the shutters, he stretched heavy canvas across the openings, treating the canvas with multiple layers of his clay pine resin mixture until it was embedded in a translucent weatherproof membrane. The canvas allowed diffused light to enter, even with shutters open, but provided a barrier that would stop claws or crude tools. The interior finishing took another month. Nathaniel built a sleeping platform raised 18 inches off the ground, giving him storage beneath and keeping him off the cold earth floor. He constructed shelves mounted high on the tree's interior walls for supplies, tools, and the few possessions he owned. A small table, 2 chairs, and a workbench completed the furnishings. Everything was built using the same careful joinery and solid construction that characterized the entire project. By late August, the cabin was functionally complete. The structure had cost him 5 months of intensive labor, working alone. Except for Magnus's brief assistance, a standard cabin required perhaps 2 weeks with 2 men working. But standing inside his completed tree shelter, Nathaniel knew he had built something unprecedented. September and October passed with Nathaniel working his trap lines and laying in supplies for winter. He cut and stacked firewood, but notably less than previous years. His calculations suggested he would need perhaps 40% of the wood a standard cabin required. He smoked fish and venison, stored root vegetables in a cold pit he dug near the tree, and prepared for isolation that could last months once heavy snow closed the high passes. November arrived with early storms that dumped 2 feet of snow across the valley in 3 days. Temperatures dropped steadily, reaching 0 degrees on November 12th. Nathaniel lit his first serious fire in the stone fireplace, watching carefully for any sign of smoke leaking into the cabin or heat affecting the tree's interior walls. The fireplace drew perfectly. Smoke rose straight up through the chimney, and within an hour, the cabin's interior temperature reached comfortable levels. What surprised Nathaniel was how little wood the fire consumed. He burned perhaps 10 pounds of pine during that first cold evening, maintaining a fire that would have required 30 pounds in his previous cabin. The massive cedar walls absorbed heat from the fire and radiated it back into the space for hours. Even after the flames died to coals, the cabin remained warm enough that he could work by candlelight, wearing only a shirt. He began keeping detailed records documenting exterior temperature, interior temperature, and fuel consumption each day. The data confirmed what his body already told him. On days when exterior temperature hovered around 15 degrees, interior temperature with a modest morning fire reached 55 to 60 degrees by afternoon and didn't drop below 45 overnight. The tree's thermal mass was performing exactly as he had calculated, storing heat during the day and releasing it slowly after dark. A storm on November 21st brought the first serious test. Wind howled through the valley with force that would have made his old cabin shake and groan. Inside the tree shelter, Nathaniel heard the wind but felt none of its effects. No drafts penetrated the tight construction. No cold air leaked through gaps that didn't exist. The massive cedar trunk and root system broke the wind's force completely, creating a protected zone of calm while chaos raged outside. He measured temperatures during the storm's peak. Exterior temperature with wind chill was approximately 10 below zero. Inside the cabin, with a fire that consumed perhaps 12 pounds of wood over 6 hours, temperature held steady at 48 degrees. The difference was 38 degrees, far exceeding his predictions. More importantly, the temperature stayed stable. In a conventional cabin, temperature fluctuated wildly as wind penetrated gaps and fires struggled against constant heat loss. The tree cabin's temperature varied by only 3 or 4 degrees over several hours. Word of the storm's severity spread through the valley as weather cleared. Several trappers had struggled desperately to maintain warmth, burning through wood supplies at alarming rates. One man's cabin had developed serious gaps when wind-driven snow forced its way between logs and froze there, expanding the cracks. Nathaniel mentioned none of his own comfort when he encountered neighbors. He simply continued his work, knowing winter's real test was still coming. January 1842 arrived with weather that made the previous year's deadly cold seem mild by comparison. A high-pressure system settled over the northern Rockies, bringing clear skies and temperatures that plummeted to depths that old-timers claimed they had never witnessed in 40 years of mountain life. The cold was so extreme it created phenomena that seemed impossible. Trees exploded at night as frozen sap expanded and shattered wood. Metal tools became brittle and snapped under normal use. Exhaled breath froze instantly and fell to the ground as ice crystals. On January 19th, the thermometer outside Nathaniel's cabin read 23 below zero at dawn. Inside, he woke comfortably under his blankets with interior temperature at 42 degrees. The fire had died to cold ash during the night, yet the cabin remained warmer than most heated structures in the valley. He rebuilt the fire using kindling and small logs, and within 30 minutes, interior temperature climbed to 55 degrees. He burned approximately 8 pounds of wood that morning. The cold intensified throughout the day rather than moderating. By afternoon, exterior temperature had dropped to 28 below zero. Nathaniel added wood to his fire twice during daylight hours, maintaining interior temperature between 52 and 58 degrees. He worked on repairing beaver traps, carved new trap stakes, and mended clothing. His hands were warm enough to handle tools with precision. His feet, raised off the ground on his sleeping platform, stayed comfortable in wool socks without additional warming. That night brought the coldest temperatures recorded in the region during the entire decade. Nathaniel's thermometer, positioned in shade away from any structure, read 31 below zero at midnight. He had maintained a modest fire throughout the evening, burning perhaps 15 pounds of wood total since morning. Before sleeping, he checked interior temperature one final time, 54 degrees. He added 2 logs to the fire, ensuring coals would last until morning, and went to bed wearing only long underwear and a wool shirt. He slept soundly for 8 hours. When he woke at dawn, interior temperature had dropped to 46 degrees. The fire was dead coals, but the massive cedar walls had held heat so effectively that, even with exterior temperature still below 25 below zero, the cabin remained comfortably above freezing. Nathaniel rebuilt his fire and made coffee, calculating fuel consumption in his head. In 24 hours of record-breaking cold, he had burned approximately 35 pounds of wood and maintained interior temperature at least 45 degrees warmer than outside, often closer to 60 degrees difference. In a standard cabin, that same 24-hour period would have required perhaps 200 pounds of wood, burned constantly just to keep interior temperature barely above freezing. Men in conventional structures were fighting desperately for survival, burning furniture when firewood ran out, huddling under every blanket they owned, enduring cold that made sleep nearly impossible. Nathaniel sat in his tree cabin, wearing comfortable clothing, drinking hot coffee, and working on projects that required warm fingers. The mathematics were undeniable. His tree-integrated design was maintaining interior temperature approximately 50 to 60 degrees warmer than exterior conditions while consuming 1/6 the fuel of conventional construction. The 26-degree advantage he had projected was conservative. The actual advantage approached 60 degrees in extreme conditions. Jacob Weatherly was 3 days overdue to reach Fort Benton when the extreme cold caught him in the mountains. He was an experienced trapper who worked the Northern Territories, traveling between trading posts to exchange furs and supplies. He had survived 15 winters in mountain country and prided himself on reading weather and planning accordingly. But this cold was beyond anything his experience had prepared him for. It was cold that killed quickly, that turned minor mistakes into death sentences. He had spent the previous night in a shallow cave, burning through his emergency wood supply, trying to stay alive. The cave provided some wind protection, but no real warmth. He hadn't slept, couldn't risk it when interior temperature barely stayed above zero despite his constant fire. At dawn, he made the decision to keep moving rather than spend another night in inadequate shelter. He knew other trappers worked this valley. If he could find a cabin, any cabin, he had a chance. By afternoon, Jacob was in serious trouble. His hands were numb inside thick mittens. His feet had lost feeling hours ago. He was making navigational mistakes, circling back on his own trail twice before recognizing his error. The mental fog that preceded serious hypothermia was settling over his thoughts like physical weight. He knew what was happening, but couldn't seem to think clearly enough to stop it. He spotted smoke rising through trees just before his legs gave out. The thin gray column was barely visible against the overcast sky, but it meant fire, shelter, survival. Jacob stumbled toward it, falling twice, driven by instinct more than conscious thought. He emerged into a Small clearing dominated by an enormous dead cedar tree, and stopped, confused. There was a cabin, but it seemed to be part of the tree itself, built into its base in a way that made no sense to his cold-addled mind. The door was substantial, probably too heavy for him to open in his weakened state. But Jacob hammered on it with numb fists, croaking sounds that were meant to be words. He heard movement inside, then the door opened, releasing a wave of warm air that felt like physical force against his frozen face. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against golden firelight, and Jacob collapsed forward into warmth he hadn't believed still existed in the world. Nathaniel caught the falling man, recognizing immediately that he was looking at advanced hypothermia. He dragged Jacob inside and closed the door against the brutal cold, then began the careful process of warming someone who had come dangerously close to freezing. He removed Jacob's frozen outer clothing, but left his inner layers, knowing too rapid warming was dangerous. He positioned him near the fire, but not too close, wrapped him in blankets, and began heating broth on the stovetop he had built into his fireplace structure. Jacob regained consciousness slowly, confused by the warmth surrounding him. His last clear memory was cold so intense it seemed impossible to survive. Now he lay in a space that felt impossibly warm, watching firelight play across wooden walls that seemed to curve around him like protective hands. Jacob stayed 3 days in Nathaniel's tree cabin, recovering from frostbite that could have cost him fingers and toes if not treated quickly. During those days, he experienced firsthand what Nathaniel had been trying to explain to skeptical trappers for months. The cabin wasn't just warmer than standard construction, it was fundamentally different in how it interacted with heat and cold. The massive cedar walls seemed to breathe warmth into the space continuously, maintaining stable temperature that felt less like a shelter fighting against winter and more like a natural warm space that winter couldn't penetrate. On the second day, when Jacob's thinking had cleared and feeling had returned painfully to his extremities, he asked detailed questions about the construction. Nathaniel explained the principles, showed him the stone insulation around the fireplace, demonstrated how tightly the front wall fitted to the tree cavity, and walked him through the thermal calculations. Jacob listened with the attention of someone whose life had been saved by this innovation and who understood exactly how close he had come to dying in conventional shelter. When Jacob was strong enough to travel, Nathaniel supplied him with food and firewood for the journey to Fort Benton. Jacob left promising to tell no one about the tree cabin, understanding that Nathaniel preferred isolation. But some stories are too remarkable to keep silent. Jacob reached Fort Benton on February 3rd and within hours had told a dozen people about the impossible cabin that had saved his life. He described the warmth, the minimal fire, the way the structure seemed to hold heat like nothing he had experienced. Trappers and traders who knew Jacob, who knew he wasn't given to exaggeration, listened with growing interest. Several had heard rumors about Frost's Folly, the mad trapper who built inside a tree. Most had dismissed it as eccentricity doomed to failure. Jacob's testimony changed that perception. He spoke with the authority of someone who had been freezing to death and found salvation in unconventional engineering. He told them the interior temperature had been comfortable enough to sit in shirt sleeves, while exterior temperature was deadly. He mentioned that Nathaniel's wood supply, visible stacked outside, was a fraction of what any standard cabin would require. Word spread from Fort Benton to other trading posts and settlements. Reverend Fletcher heard the story during a visit to a homestead 40 miles from Nathaniel's Valley. The Reverend's previous theological objections to tree dwelling softened considerably when he learned it had saved a man's life. He made a special trip to Nathaniel's location in late February, arriving on a day when exterior temperature was 5 below zero, and finding Nathaniel working outside the cabin in moderate clothing, comfortable enough that he had left the door open to let in fresh air. Fletcher spent 2 hours inside the tree cabin, experiencing the warmth that so many had described. He examined the construction with new appreciation, recognizing that what he had dismissed as regression was actually sophisticated engineering. He asked about the fuel consumption, about maintenance requirements, about whether the design could be replicated elsewhere. Nathaniel answered patiently, understanding that Fletcher's interest represented a shift in community perception. Magnus Halvorson arrived at Nathaniel's cabin in March 1842 with specific questions about construction techniques. He had located a suitable tree on his own property, a massive dead fir with a natural cavity and protective root structure similar to Nathaniel's cedar. He wanted to build a tree-integrated cabin before the next winter and needed guidance on critical details. Would Nathaniel share his methods? Nathaniel agreed without hesitation. His innovation had never been about personal advantage or proprietary knowledge. It was about survival, about building shelter that actually protected people from the cold that had killed Thomas. If Magnus wanted to replicate the design, Nathaniel would help him succeed. They spent 3 days together examining Nathaniel's cabin in detail, discussing every aspect of construction, from foundation preparation to roof sealing to fireplace insulation. Magnus took careful notes, sketching details and writing measurements in a small book he carried for recording homestead information. He asked about mistakes Nathaniel had made, about techniques that had worked better than expected, about materials that could be substituted if specific resources weren't available. The conversation was methodical and practical, two men sharing knowledge about surviving in country that killed the unprepared. Construction of Magnus's tree cabin began in April and continued through early summer. He worked alone most days, but occasionally traveled to Nathaniel's valley to verify techniques or ask about problems he encountered. His tree was larger than Nathaniel's, offering more interior space but requiring adjustments to maintain thermal efficiency. Magnus built a slightly different front wall design, using overlapping planks instead of horizontal logs, creating a structure that was equally weather-tight but faster to construct. By August, Magnus's cabin was complete. He moved in immediately, occupying the structure through fall and into winter. The results matched what Nathaniel had achieved. Interior temperatures remained comfortable with minimal fuel consumption. The massive fir trunk provided insulation and thermal mass that conventional construction couldn't replicate. Magnus documented his experience carefully, measuring and recording temperatures throughout the winter months. Word of the second successful tree cabin spread through homesteading communities. Isaac Thorne, who owned property 30 miles west of Magnus, made the journey to examine both cabins during October 1842. He was planning to build winter shelter before snow closed the passes and was trying to decide between conventional construction and the tree-integrated method that everyone was discussing. After spending time in both cabins and talking extensively with Nathaniel and Magnus, Isaac's decision was clear. Isaac's tree cabin, built inside a massive cedar similar to Nathaniel's, was completed by late November. His construction incorporated refinements from both previous builds, plus his own innovations. He used a different chinking mixture, created a more efficient fireplace design, and developed a window system that provided more light without sacrificing thermal performance. 3 tree cabins now existed across the region, each demonstrating the same remarkable warmth retention. The winter of 1842 to 1843 was less severe than the previous year's brutal cold, but it was sufficient to demonstrate that tree-integrated cabins worked reliably under various conditions. All 3 existing structures performed exactly as designed, maintaining comfortable interior temperatures with minimal fuel consumption. More importantly, the men living in them survived winter with energy to spare for productive work rather than desperate fuel gathering and constant fire maintenance. Spring 1843 brought a wave of construction as word continued spreading through trapping and homesteading communities. Men who had mocked Nathaniel's innovation 2 years earlier now sought his advice about finding suitable trees and planning their own integrated shelters. The phrase tree cabin entered common usage, referring specifically to structures built into or against massive, old-growth trees using thermal principles Nathaniel had pioneered. Not everyone adopted the technique. In regions where suitable trees didn't exist, conventional construction remained necessary. Some trappers preferred mobility over permanent structures and continued building temporary shelters. Others simply couldn't overcome the psychological barrier of living inside what appeared to be a tree trunk. But among those who worked territories with old-growth forests and who valued survival efficiency over tradition, tree cabins became increasingly common. By 1845, an estimated 15 to 20 tree-integrated shelters existed across the Northern Rockies and Pacific Northwest territories. Each builder added personal modifications based on available materials and specific site conditions, but all followed the core principles Nathaniel had established. Reduced exterior surface area, integration with natural insulation, protected roof structures, and careful attention to fireplace isolation. The technique had evolved from individual innovation to recognized methodology. The economic advantages extended beyond fuel savings. A trapper or homesteader who spent less time gathering firewood and less energy fighting against inadequate shelter could devote more effort to productive work. Trap lines could be extended farther from base camps. Hunting could continue through cold periods that previously forced men to shelter in place. The improved thermal efficiency translated directly to improved survival odds and economic productivity. Nathaniel watched this evolution with quiet satisfaction. He had never sought recognition or financial reward for his innovation. The knowledge that his methods were saving lives and making frontier existence more tolerable was sufficient compensation. He continued working his trap lines, maintained his tree cabin meticulously, and answered questions from anyone who asked. His brother's death had created purpose that extended far beyond personal survival. The technique spread through oral transmission rather than written documentation. Trappers and homesteaders shared knowledge conversationally, explaining methods they had learned from Nathaniel or Magnus or Isaac, adding their own observations and improvements. The innovation became part of frontier knowledge passed between people who needed it, preserved through practical application rather than formal recording. By 1850, when the beaver trade had collapsed completely and many trappers had moved to other pursuits, tree cabins remained scattered throughout old-growth forest regions. Some were occupied by new inhabitants who had discovered and claimed abandoned structures. Others served as emergency shelters for travelers caught in severe weather. Few, including Nathaniel's original cedar cabin, continued housing their builders who had found no reason to leave homes that had proven themselves through the harshest tests winter could deliver. Nathaniel Frost died on March 14, 1867, at age 52. The cause was pneumonia following a winter illness that his tree cabin's warmth couldn't prevent. He was buried next to Thomas on the hillside overlooking the valley where both brothers had sought their fortunes 3 decades earlier. A simple wooden marker identified him by name and dates, making no mention of innovations or techniques that had spread across territories. His tree cabin passed to a young homesteading couple, Daniel and Sarah Pritchard, who had claimed adjacent land and discovered the structure while exploring their property boundaries. They moved in during summer 1867, initially viewing it as temporary shelter while they planned conventional construction. Winter changed their perspective. The cabin's thermal performance was so superior to anything they had experienced that building a replacement seemed pointless. They remained in the tree shelter, raising 2 children in the space Nathaniel had created. By 1870, the original motivation behind tree cabin development had faded from memory for many who used the technique. Younger trappers and homesteaders knew tree-integrated construction worked well, but rarely knew the specific history of how and why it had developed. The innovation had become normalized, accepted as one valid approach among several for building frontier shelter. That anonymity would have pleased Nathaniel, who had never wanted personal glory. Historians estimate that between 1840 and 1900, somewhere between 50 and 100 tree-integrated cabins were built across the Rocky Mountain and Pacific Northwest regions. The exact number is impossible to determine because many were constructed in remote locations, occupied briefly, and then abandoned as population shifted. Some rotted and collapsed after decades of neglect. Others burned in forest fires. A few remained standing into the 20th century, their original purposes forgotten, but their fundamental soundness evident in their survival. The technical principles Nathaniel had discovered remained valid regardless of construction style. Reduced surface area exposure decreased heat loss. Natural insulation improved thermal retention. Integration with existing protective structures saved labor and materials. These principles influenced later frontier construction, even when builders weren't consciously aware of their origins. Cabins built with partial earth berming, structures positioned against cliff faces, shelters that utilized natural features for wind protection, all reflected understanding that Nathaniel had systematized through his obsessive analysis of thermal efficiency. The phrase, built like a tree cabin, became minor frontier, complement during the late 1800s, indicating construction solid enough to withstand serious testing. The saying survived in a few isolated communities into the early 20th century before fading as frontier life modernized and older expressions lost relevance. By 1950, virtually no one remembered what the phrase originally meant or that it referenced actual structures built inside massive trees. Nathaniel Frost's legacy persists not in monuments or written records, but in the simple fact that people survived who might otherwise have frozen. The innovation born from watching his brother die prevented other deaths across decades and territories. That Thomas's tragedy led to others' survival would have mattered more to Nathaniel than any recognition history might have granted him.